This is going to be a slightly different video to my normal lists, because I'm not going to be focusing on specific models, but instead the movements that power them. I would draw your attention at this point to the title of the video. These are not necessarily what I believe to be the best movements that money can buy at this budget price point, but the most interesting. So you aren't going to see basic workhorse movements from ETA, Miyota or Seiko featuring here, respect them though I do. That doesn't mean that movements from these brands are excluded, I just won't be talking about common garden mechanical, quartz or automatic movements that you'll find in a lot of budget pieces. I won't try and define interesting, because that's subjective, but watch along if you will and see if there's anything that takes your fancy. While we aren't focusing on specific watches, I will be name dropping some models and ranges that I would consider for some of the movements as and where I can. Hard to quantify a set of rules for a video like this, so the only one that I'm going to stick hard and fast to is that a watch has to be available for less than $1,000 with the movement being discussed, in order for it to be eligible to feature on the list. Given that we're not focusing on specific watches, there also won't be the usual ascending order to proceedings. I would just like to add, as a final distinction, there are plenty of watches that tell the time in interesting and unusual ways, but a lot of those use standard movements to do so, and while I'm sure I will feature them in a future video, they aren't the focus here. With all that said, let's get into the video. If you want a Swiss-made automatic on your wrist, the very cheapest option that money can buy is the System 51. It's entirely machine-made and is named after its construction. The movement is crafted from only 51 individual parts, which is considerably lower than your average automatic. This helps keep costs down, but the simplification doesn't end there. The entire movement is held together with a single central screw. The System 51 was developed by Swatch for use in their own models, hence the affordable price point. There are a number of ranges that feature the movement, but perhaps the most famous is the Blancpain collaboration. Regardless of which model you choose, the movements for the System 51 range always bear interesting decorations, and most models have an exhibition caseback. Personally, I think this is a really good starting point in horology, as it can help you to understand the inner workings of a watch movement in a way that is a lot more accessible than most. The Neo movement is an unusual one, as it isn't a particularly common practice for smaller micro brands to develop or heavily modify movements in their watches. Given the unique design of Niwa's watches, they have had to devise a movement that was compatible with the Nixie tubes, which you may know as cathode displays. Their two models, the Lunacod and the Nixie, both make use of this movement, which starts life as a Seiko VK63, but is modified extensively so that it can incorporate the high voltage circuitry required to display the time through the Nixie tubes. A rather unique feature of these watches is that you set the time on the movement using a series of taps with a magnet. I can't say this is something I've seen used anywhere else, and would surely qualify this heavily modified quartz as interesting, in my book at least. Now, you might scoff at the inclusion of the EcoDrive, as it's hardly an uncommon movement. However, I do think it's an interesting one. The movements are quartz, but unlike regular movements, do not rely on a battery for power. Instead, they rely on solar cells to capture energy from light, and any kind of light works, though sunlight is the most effective. This charge is transferred to a specially designed rechargeable cell, which will degrade over time, much like the batteries in phones or electric cars, but given the minuscule amount of energy we're talking about here, will last for much longer. Citizens suggest that over the span of 20 years, the cell might degrade by roughly 20%. But given that it will be constantly being charged by any light source, it's highly unlikely you'd notice that difference. Now, of course, experiences are going to vary, but it does make EcoDrive models some of the very best set it and forget it options available. While nowhere near as prevalent as the aforementioned EcoDrive, the kinetic movements from Seiko have a somewhat similar premise in that they are both quartz movements that seek to find an alternative power source instead of a traditional battery. The power source in question here is not light, but rather your own movement. In the same way as an automatic, kinetic movements feature a rotor that moves as your wrist does. Instead of the energy being transferred to the mainspring as it would be in an automatic, it's used to spin a tiny electric generator, which in turn stores that energy in a rechargeable battery. I think it's a cool concept and certainly a unique idea for a movement, but unlike the EcoDrive, it hasn't really caught on in the same way, possibly because the idea of set it and forget it doesn't really work for the kinetic unless you wear it every now and again. At the time of writing, Seiko only actually produced 5 watches featuring this movement. Earlier in the video, I discussed the System 51. While that movement is indeed interesting in and of itself, it led to further innovations within the Swatch group that eventually led to the creation of the PowerMatic 80 movement. You might look back at my point regarding standard movements not featuring in the video and be a little dismissive of this, as the PowerMatic 80 has become quite the staple movement in the Swatch group roster. However, I don't think that does the movement justice. The 80 in the name refers to the power reserve when fully wound. You might think that 80 hours of reserve is overkill in a watch that winds itself when you wear it. However, if you've got a timepiece that you're wearing to work, or as part of a larger collection in rotation, it means that you aren't having to wind it and set the time every Monday. Most common manual and automatic movements cap out between 38 and 42 hours of power reserve, so having 80 actually gives you a lot more flexibility. Though I do appreciate that for some, the process of setting and forgetting is not what they want at all, and they'd rather have the regular watch interaction. If less time setting sounds good to you though, the most famous watch featuring the movement is the PRX, and they just released some cool new models to drool over. Micro-Rotor movements are usually considerably more expensive than the $1,000 price point. So this is one of a few instances on the list where if you want a specific movement like this in your collection, the best budget way to do it is with Far Eastern movements. You can do that in a couple of ways: buying from brands trading their wares on AliExpress and other similar sites, or spending extra for watches that still use the movements but are put together elsewhere. Baltic would be a prime example of this in relation to the Micro-Rotor movement. The Micro-Rotor itself not only looks really cool, but actually serves a purpose. Having the rotor built into the movement instead means that the movement can be slimmer, as you aren't having to bolt the rotor underneath it. That in turn means that the watch can also be slimmer. A mechanical chronograph is not a simple movement. Just looking at one is enough to make you realise that you're dealing with a good deal of extra complexity compared to a regular mechanical or automatic watch movement. This complexity comes at a cost, and that cost is, well, the costs. They don't come cheap at all, especially if you want a premium brand, Swiss made, or indeed both on the dial. The complexity also means that very few watchmakers invest the money into research and development so that they can create their own. It's far easier to buy them in from existing suppliers or to make adaptations and improvements to existing calibers. This is where the Seagull ST19 range of movements comes in. They're based on a movement sold by Venus, a defunct Swiss watchmaker in the 50s, and are now produced by Seagull in the Far East. While I hear they're tightening their belts in terms of who they sell these to and are keen to keep the movements more in-house moving forwards, Perhaps the most famous line of watches featuring this movement under $1,000 is the 01 series from Studio Underdog. Back to the Far East we go once again, as we often have to in order to find savings in this day and age. A tourbillon is usually a complication that you'd only find in very high-end Swiss-made watches. If a mechanical chronograph movement is complex, just seeing a tourbillon in operation points towards a level of human innovation that I personally struggle to comprehend. I like to think of myself as quite a driven individual, but it's really humbling when you see what other people have developed across their lifetimes. While I'm sure there are probably some US and EU based companies who build watches using the imported movements featuring these budget tourbillons, I have to be honest, I don't know of any. By all means enlighten me in the comments. Personally, I bought the cheapest tourbillon I could find on AliExpress, not to wear as a watch, but just to have as an object of interest in my collection. That sounds bonkers reading it back, but I can assure you I've spent more than enough time studying the complication in operation to make it worthwhile. In the last video on my channel, I spent over 10 minutes gushing about how much I love the spring drive. A movement which combines the accuracy of quartz, the manpower of a mechanical or automatic movement, and produces the cleanest sweep of any movement I've seen. Now, they are far too expensive to feature on this list, but the Meca-quartz certainly is not, and still manages to combine some of these desirable attributes. If you look at the Boulder Field Medic I'm using here as an example, there is no second hand on this model, so no ticking to give away the fact that it has a quartz movement. What you're seeing instead is the chronograph hand, which when in operation travels smoothly around the dial. Now, you're not going to get an exhibition case back showing off the craftsmanship like you might in a spring drive, and you are going to have to replace the battery as you would with other quartz movements. But the trade-off here is that the Meca-quartz is going to cost you a fraction of what a spring drive would. The final entry on the list I've included as a word of caution. There are some movements out there which are interesting, but not necessarily for the right reasons. The fossil twist is one such deceptive cautionary tale. It was described as a movement that gave the look of an automatic, but with the accuracy of a quartz. Notice a key word there, look. This isn't a well thought out integration between the two movements. Actually, it's just a quartz, with a rotor on the back that does nothing but spin a balance wheel. There is no connection between the two, and this boils down to fancy window dressing. There's an excellent article covering this harrowing tale, which I will link in the description. And while not a serious entry to this list, I hope it serves as a justification for why it's important to always look at the movement of a watch before you make a purchase. Sometimes interesting isn't necessarily a good thing. So, those were what I consider to be the most interesting watch movements you can pick up in a watch that costs less than $1,000. But I am just one man, and surely not infallible, so I'm confident there are going to be movements that I've overlooked, or ones that I don't even know exist. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What experience have you had with these movements? Are there any that have caught your interest, or are there any that you think I've missed out that should have featured? Let me know. I welcome the discussion. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen or found it informative, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing if you want to see more content like this.